Aaron White, CEO of Blissfully, and now part of Vendr. Aaron, we talked last time, had this phenomenal conversation about how you run your engineering team because you are arguably, at least as far as I know, the best engineering manager that I've ever encountered, that I know of. You create the most output of features of any team that I know of. And we asked you what it is that you do. And you said there's quite a few parts. And we got to the first, maybe one or two. Today, hopefully, we'll get to the remainder. But to summarize, there was one of them was this: minimize the time from thought to action. So minimize the time from I have an idea of what I want to build to building the prototype, minimize the amount of time from prototype to piloting it and putting it in customers' hands, minimizing the time of someone's got a problem that other people find out about it and can help them. That's where you use the rubber duck channel. Minimize the amount of time between I have feedback for someone and then giving them that feedback. Minimize the amount of time of I realize now this person's not going to make it and letting that person go. It's all about minimizing the time from the current state to the next state. That was phenomenal. And so now, Aaron, we got through those pieces, the rubber duck channel and minimizing time to next action, which is really just a bias to action, translating every thought into what is that action and then saying, how fast can I get that done? But there's more. Aaron, can you please share with us?
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
Okay, great.
I think we may have framed this this way in the last combo, but I think it's worth revisiting because it's deeply held belief of mine that, again, I'll start with that quote from Andreessen Horowitz that I'm going to modify, which is, software is eating the world, but software eats other software first. And, what that means to me, why I believe that rather, is because there's nothing special about software. If you see someone with a great app, you can just go out there and clone it. We're seeing that left and right. Now, there may be things about your business that are defensible. Maybe you've got network effects. Maybe you've got a data moat. Maybe the expertise to build what you have is just very hard to find. But those are kind of more business-related concerns. But for building prosaic, software, it really is a game about speed. It's a foot race, and you really have to understand that. And so, at the highest level, like how do you win a foot race? I'd argue there's a few tenets. One is,
and before you even go there, can we say why it's so important and why it's a foot race and why I have to win? Because most people would say, wait a second, no. If I build a product and I get product market fit, I'm done. It doesn't matter if it took me 3 months or 3 years or 30 years to build it. Once I get product market fit, that's it. Now I just have to scale it. Yeah. And I think what you're saying is, no, you haven't won. All you've done is created a prototype for the rest of the world to copy. And then they're going to copy it and they'll quickly catch up to you. And then if they're iterating faster than you, they'll make it better than you. And suddenly your product market fit will no longer match what they have and everyone will turn to their product. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right.
Whatever velocity you got to where you're at, someone else is going to get there faster for several reasons. One is you've already painted a map. If it's clear that what you have is working, they may not fully understand why, but they've got some advantage. If they're smart, they've got an advantage. Number two, technology is always evolving. What you probably built it on and built it with is suddenly not the fastest path to get to where you're going. So they might have a speed advantage there as well, right? Because leverage accrues over time as technology gets better and better. So you really, I think if you're going to play the technology entrepreneurship game, it's hard to get comfortable and you have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And one of those things is you better be faster than everybody else. So yeah, that's exactly it.
Perfect.
I break it down for the team in a couple different ways, right? There's empathy for what success looks like for your customer. Like if you understand your customer's pain better than anybody else, and you develop your understanding of that pain faster and more nuanced than anybody else, and again, speed matters here, then you're going to be able to course correct better than anybody else. And then second to that, we'll dive into all these, but second to that is prioritization, right? If you understand what matters to your customer and you approach it with ruthless prioritization, then you will be bringing the big hits that matter most first, right? Put first things first, the rocks instead of pebbles. good prioritization is only possible if you've got great understanding of your customer.
Hmm.
And then from there, you need to get really good at putting the very first version of what you have out there. And then, you might call that rapid prototyping. Engineers might call it walking skeleton. We happen to call it lightning bolt. Like, what is the fastest path between our understanding of success and just putting a first version out there?
Hmm.
Bad version, ugly baby, take your pick. There's a lot of names for this thing, but get there fast. And then lastly, this Kaizen, this iterative motion. Now that you've put something out there, now that you can sort of play with the clay, you're in a position to really rapidly iterate something that is working. It may not be working well, it may not be the best thing. You can't improve something and use all that knowledge about customer, what customers want, what the priorities are, until you've got something out there that you can begin to play with and improve. And so it's like deeply critical to actually be working with the clay. Software building is it's a competitive sport in a way, but it's also like being like a woodworker. Like, there's a lot of craftsmanship that goes into it, and so you can't figure out if the experience is working until you're literally kind of playing with it. Sometimes that means prototype, but often it means software itself. So it's a foot race, and you need to be sort of excellent across the board at all those things.
You mentioned the tech stack, that's also changing.
Yes.
So I'll throw it out there. I know of at least 2 companies that completely rebuild their product one does it every 18 months, the other does it every 24 months. Incredible. So that in order to take advantage of the latest tech stack, but also to re-architect, because now there's new use cases that weren't contemplated in the original product.
Yeah.
Is that the only way to take advantage of the new tech stack and remain the fastest developing entity?
I think I've got some good news there. Like, that's particularly aggressive. I think one thing that I've watched it either mire or even kill entire companies is rewriting your entire backend, your entire product experience. That's a huge undertaking, and you're likely to miss a lot of things, to go slowly. In general, software architects are wary of that approach. All that is to say is not that it can't be the right approach, but the bar to clearing it is very high. You've got to really be good at what you're doing to pull that off. I'd say the good news in today's era, and I can get into some of like the actual technical choices that we've made that enable us to do things like that, is that we now live in a world where we know a ton about how APIs work, microservices, decomposing larger problems into smaller ones. And that gives you a lot of flexibility, because now it's not an either or. It's not never rewrite something. It's not rewrite everything. It's selectively dial in which pieces do you want to rewrite, which could be 1 of 10 or it could be 9 of 10. But we have options today that just simply didn't exist years ago, because we've learned how to decompose really large products. And also, one cool thing about building in, 2020 and beyond, I mean, even 2010 and beyond, is that there are so many awesome SaaS companies that are API first in their offerings that allow you to truly, stand on the shoulders of giants and build things that are native to you and not something that you shouldn't be building. So for instance, one way to look at things is this work I'm about to embark on doing something that I could foresee other companies doing? Like, would I do this work at every other company? And if the answer is yes, then immediately it's not a unique part of your value proposition. It's a tax, right? To get really technological for a second, like, Vendr runs entirely on AWS Lambda. We would take a very serverless approach to things. A lot of companies are building on Kubernetes, but when I look at things like Docker, Kubernetes, EC2, that's kind of very low level developer operations work that folks are doing across many different companies, which means inherently it's non-unique to a particular value prop, which means it's a tax. And if you can eliminate that tax, say with something like serverless, then you really ought to consider that, because that allows you to just ignore a huge pile of work, push it into the platform. The same is true if you're building off, CRMs like HubSpot, they have great APIs, or things like Airtable. There's all these other tools now that you can get real velocity from, if you are good at identifying that that's not part of my unique value proposition, I probably should look to outsource that in some way.
Yes, makes complete sense. And then you talk, and this again, a little bit of a divergence of creating the fastest development team on earth, but I've got you here. So I'll ask you, you mentioned microservices, and we can sort of chunk a huge problem up into smaller problems and then rewrite a portion of them, not all of them. I've people, it's there, and you say we know how to do that, but you know how to do that. Not everybody knows how to do that. I've had CEOs tell me, I'm done with microservices. We're building monolithic. Microservices are a nightmare. I've heard other CEOs say, monolithic is a nightmare. We need to go to microservices. So what is the answer, and what's the way to do it properly?
I'm going to get real cutting edge with you for a second on this one, if
Yes,
that's okay.
that's all we want. We just want cutting edge.
Okay, you're going to get cutting edge. We actually at Vendr use, we build as though we're a monolith, but it actually is divided into 200 different microservices under the hood. So let me give you a little bit of a history of compute, if you'll forgive me here. Like, I have a background in computer science and programming language theory, so like this is very near and dear to my heart. In the olden days, when you're writing a program on like your Unix cluster, you fire up a file, you write your code, and you run it. One file, one program, right? That was it. And then the world got really complicated because as your programs get larger, you subdivide the files. And at some point, your program gets so complicated, it's not just that you've subdivided it into multiple files, you subdivide where it even runs. So you have a distributed system, right? Where you've got things running on different pieces. That's sort of the origin of microservices. But that's really tough to do correctly because all of those have interfaces and dependencies between each other. And so when you make a deep change, like, oh, now customers look totally different. Suddenly you've got to go update, 100 services that all need a new understanding, and you need to time those deployments really carefully. And if you have teams owning each of those microservices, you have a human coordination problem on top of that. So I think when people struggle with microservices, that's exactly why. It's both predictable and unavoidable if you take a kind of standard approach to it. What I think is interesting is if you look at what's happening with code these days, and I can point to some cool projects here, very cutting edge ones like Unison Web. I'll put a little plug out for what that team's doing. What you are doing now is you're saying, let me write a piece of code, and instead of me deciding how it's carved up over this distributed infrastructure, the programming language itself, or at least my kind of constructs in it, decide it for me. So for instance, if you need to take an array in code and say, I want to calculate this value for every customer, well, you can do that in memory, but imagine you've got 100,000 customers. Well, the code now is smart enough to say, actually, we're going to need to divide that up, do like a Google map reduce on this thing, and the compiler will do the hard work of the distributed system thing. So you're writing one file, one program, just like the olden days, but the system is carving it up for you. That gives you the benefits of scalability, but you don't have to mentally manage all that operational complexity of deployments and coordinating teams, et cetera. The world is headed to a place, mark my words, where people will write small sets, small programs that the system, the platform will carve up into a giant distributed system. Today, people manage that by hand. They carve up different Docker containers, they carve up different microservices in Kubernetes. It's hard, and it introduces that human element. Our approach with serverless is we have one backend code base. It is one thing. It happens to have 200 different entry points, but we can modify all of them in one deploy that takes 90 seconds. And so we get the benefit of having all these different microservices from a scalability standpoint, but all the managerial, simplicity of having just one little code base. It might as well be that monolith, even though it's running as a massive distributed system. So that's something that's been recently enabled, and I think you're going to see even more companies leaning into that. And that's awesome. And actually, if you look at like crypto, for instance, it's a great example because when you're working on crypto systems, you're publishing, a smart contract. Well, that thing's about to run on, tens of thousands of nodes out in the wild. You have no idea, right? You just sort of publish the contract and there it goes. So that's another sort of similar modern incarnation of that same concept. So I think it's like, you kind of have to know the history a little bit to see why we got into this mess that slows companies down today, to see a way out of it. But the way out of it is here and getting increasingly better.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaron. All right, now let's go back to the original agenda, which is filling in all of the rest of the important things beside we talked about that bias to action, those rubber duck channels, and you mentioned all of them.
Yeah.
Let's dive in there.
Great. So the first one was sort of customer empathy, and the if you are, I hope most folks in startup land already know this, so this is like preaching to the choir, but like if you build it, they will come has been disproven over and over again, right? Your intuition as an individual rarely survives, first contact, right, with the customer. And I think of Mike Tyson, as well. Like everybody has a plan till they get punched in the face. Like sometimes it can feel like that. Like you're so confident that what you built is correct, and you put it in front of a customer, and it's like, oh man, I was so wrong. And then you have to ask yourself, how long did it take me to get punched in the face? Like, could I have done that a week ago, 2 months ago, a year ago? The longer you build in the dark and you don't expose it to your customers, the harder that's going to sting. So developing an empathy for your customers means engaging them frequently, because you just don't know until you know. You have to be in that, like, working with them. So that extends from leadership through product, obviously, but it should extend through engineers. And if you know what the customer's actually after and you keep a real good up-to-date understanding of that, then another phrase that I love from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, like all-time classic. More people need to read that.
Totally agree.
Yeah, so good. I'm going to reread it like this weekend, I think. Begin with the end in mind is such a powerful concept. So if we know what the customer wants, we can say, okay, this is something that we know will satisfy them. We've vetted it with them. Articulate that. That's what success looks like. And then everybody in your organization should understand that exact same thing through engineering. The stories they work on should be written in customer-facing language. Like I should be able to point a customer at our Kanban board of issues we're working on, and they should be able to make sense of it. Because if they can't, it's not clear that we understand what they want and people are focused on it. So customer empathy is number one. Get close to them early and speak in their language internally. Don't deviate from that. You talk about module X doing service Y, you're in the weeds, right? Yep. Like that's not what customers care about. And so you, by extension, probably shouldn't either.
Yep, totally agree.
Rapid prioritization I put as number 2, ruthless prioritization is number 2. That one's really challenging. This is a form of, if you understand what success looks like, you really have to understand sort of this essentialism approach. Like, what is the true essence of what they're trying to accomplish? Boil it down as much as you can, because every feature that you think you want to add, every featurette or micro interaction that you think is meaningful, it may be, you may need to do it, but every dependency that you add slows you down. And so being able to carve up exactly what you're hoping to deliver as small as possible and put the most important things first, that should be your roadmap. And if you're, should be reviewing that constantly, because things will creep in there all the time that people believe is the most important thing from their particular perspective. It might be an opportunity for you to learn and adjust the roadmap based on what they've seen. It might be an opportunity for you to work with them to educate them on, you actually sort of like didn't bias this thing correctly. Let's work together to get there. But you have to constantly reviewing that roadmap with that essentialist view and then attack your critical path. And if you're not doing that, the weeks go quick. Now there's a lot of startups that will throw out that, we know that like default dead, default alive. Like if you're cash flow positive, you're default alive. Most companies are not default alive, you're default dead. And if you're default dead, I've seen companies that put a clock in front of their team that says, we have this many weeks to live. And I think that's wonderful, because like, it's true. Like if you don't figure it out, you should watch that clock tick down. It should give you concern. And that, just like death is clarifying, about what's important in life, knowing that your startup has an expiration date on it is clarifying about what are the big things that we really need to be tackling. What has a high likelihood of moving the needle and customers care about the most? Put those first things first.
Makes complete sense. Great.
And incredibly hard in practice, right?
Yes.
Incredibly hard in practice, especially as you even get to even a modicum of scale. It's incredibly hard. But
well, and I imagine it's because you've now very quickly put this prototype in front of real customers, real users, they each have reactions to it, and they each have different reactions to it.
Yeah.
So now you have to have a way of grouping reactions and choosing which group is the most valuable group to then deliver or solve their pain.
Yeah. There's a lot of great frameworks for this. There's a lot of great tooling for this. I would recommend leaning into those kind of products and frameworks, earlier rather than later, because it's way too easy to sort of delude
What
yourself.
specifically? What specific examples?
Yeah, I think from a tooling perspective, the one that we use and I'm a fan of is called productboard.com. So it acts as a CRM for customer feedback. Like if you email, feedback at vendor.com, for instance, it goes straight into that tool. And our team knows what customer said what on what date. We tie their feedback to existing features that need improvement, potential upside, new features. And then we see how many people cared about that thing. We can interview them to put a bias on it, and then see a prioritized list of things and line it up with our strategy and come up with an excellent roadmap. And even better, when we finally deliver that feature, we know exactly who to go call and say, 18 days ago, you said this and we just delivered it. And that blows minds, right? So there's a lot of frameworks though for capturing this kind of feedback and scoring it, but find a objective system to do it, because if you rely on your instinct, you will very quickly start getting into that sort of feedback loop internally that makes you think certain things are more important than they are. And
Yes.
it's easy to start deviating. You'll do
Yes.
it, your team will do it, everybody will do it. So, find an objective way to kind of catalog and measure.
Makes complete sense. Excellent. All
Yeah.
right. The next step.
Next step. So now that you've got this, you understand what the customer wants. It allows you to, really prioritize and put first things first and keep people on, an objective path. Now it's about how do we get something out the door as fast as possible for a first version. And different companies call these things different things. Again, we call it like lightning bolt. I believe Envision calls it bad version. Other folks might call it the ugly baby. But the goal should be, how do we put anything out that delivers essentially at ends to end, provides some form of the solution, no matter how raw, no matter how ugly, as fast as humanly possible. That's your task. And you need to charge everybody from product and engineering and design to thinking that through. It won't, I think what people find is that if you start framing it really aggressively, you start to get into these conversations of, but like the MVP will be too ugly, it won't be usable enough. We know that. We're going to iterate on it. We're not going to stop there. We need everybody to feel both comfortable that we're going to do that, and we must follow through on that. But the more dependencies you start layering in, again, the same thing starts happening where you start working on the wrong things and you kind of start, hill climbing in a different direction. And you will take way longer to get any first version out the door to get punched in the face by the customer. So might as well just take your lumps as fast as possible. Put the dumbest version out right away. We do that, in a couple of there's some technical tricks that we do for that. So number one, it's always fair game to show customers mocks and get feedback on that. It's always fair game in my mind to put up a really bad prototype and code behind a feature flag, not a big deal. We practice API first development, which allows us to add the API that would serve some new experience so that two things can happen. One, we can parallelize backend and front-end development, but two, front-end can put a version out in front of customers in the product, feels real, to start getting that feedback even before it is. But now you're getting that feedback. And the number of times that you will think that you understood it, maybe no matter how good your prioritization plan was, when you really put something in front of a customer that they expect to use and play with, the feedback quality goes through the roof because people start truly visualizing themselves using it because now they're using something. And now you've opened up a ton of opportunity. You have more input to prioritize properly. You're going to do frequent small improvements. And not only that, but you're getting what I call area under the curve. Like if you think of time on the x-axis and value on the y-axis, the longer you wait to deliver anything, you might think you're going to hit the perfect value prop. Maybe you will, probably you won't. But if you put an ugly version out here, even if it doesn't kind of achieve your quality bar, then sort of the integrated area under the curve tends to be higher. So you're getting more value in the hands of your customer, more valuable feedback and response. So like find ways to lightning bolt that first version out, and culturally fight anybody who poo-poos it. If there's somebody inside your company goes, oh, that sucks. Whoa, no, 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 no. You should be celebrating how fast this got out the door, because there are teams that will spend months to years before they show anybody anything. And we do not want to be that. And if you start adding anxiety, you're adding another dependency. How do we please this person? How do we clean that quality, or clear that quality bar? That might not even be the right one, but it's going to put that into your product and engineering team's heads, and that is fatal, because anxiety causes inaction. And so you're trying to remove that everywhere you can. That's why we tell people, like, don't be afraid of failure. It's easy to say, it's hard in practice. You really have to fight to make sure that people don't feel like they're failing when they're putting out these sort of like early, ugly lightning bolt versions.
Yeah. It's almost like you not only don't have to denigrate it, you actually have to cheer it. You have to celebrate it.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. Like, high five. I mean, we did we had an all hands this year where we did the like ugly baby high five. Like, hey, we put an ugly baby out in the world. Let me tell you how much I hate our baby, but also I love it. Like, it's really great. Like, it's got some maturing to do, but boy, is this thing awesome.
Love it. So you celebrate the ugliest baby.
Celebrate the ugliest baby. Yeah, because you're always going to love your baby.
Right. Exactly.
But that's I mean, I would say that's probably the culturally toughest thing to get right, is getting people comfortable with moving fast to an ugly first version.
Yes.
So that brings us to the fourth point, which is Kaizen. And this is from...
And actually, but let's take on the third point for a second. So we're already adopting internally in our team many of your methods. And we already heard from the last interview this bias to action to get the prototype out there insanely quickly and get it piloted insanely quickly. And we're doing that now. But we're doing it insanely quickly internally, users. And what you're saying is that doesn't even count. It's got to be piloted externally.
What I want, like, yes and to your question. Like, I think you should celebrate that you're getting internal people to play with it really fast, because I think a lot of folks don't even manage to get there. So you already have a leg up over most product development life cycles, where they won't even show the thing off till they feel, even internally, till they feel like it's, ready. One of the advantages of rubber ducking is, everybody in the company can see where you're at long before you launch it. So what's the difference? You help pull anxiety left, right? Pull it earlier in the process. If we get over the anxiety of talking about our work publicly while we build it, and having the CTO or the CEO in the channels of individual engineers watching what's happening, commenting on it, if we can get past that anxiety, which is not easy, but if you do it, then there's a lot less anxiety later on about showing the company the first version, because they've been watching the entire time, which is cool.
Right.
So definitely celebrate that, because I don't think a lot of companies even achieve that. But take it a step further, right? Like, what does it take to put it in front of a customer and play with it? And customers, if you build good relationships with them, and I think that part is the fun part of business. It's like, here's your problem. I'm going to explain to you that I understand it. The better my, empathy for you is, and it's kind of like the Mochary Method. Like, if I can talk about it back to you, like, hell yeah, Aaron, like, you do get, what my issues are. Then when I say, I want to show you something ugly, it's, I'm not even sure I'd call it like beta. It's definitely, maybe even pre-alpha. Most times customers are like, yes, I want to see that. I might even use it. And I know there'll be bugs.
Right.
But the cool part is, they're very willing for that. And then on top of that, they'll start giving you bug reports. And those bug reports are instantly validated. It's something a customer ran into while earnestly trying to use software they knew wasn't going to meet the kind of production mark. That's gold. Right. You're getting gold nuggets suddenly.
Yes.
Right. So
great.
It's a yes and.
Perfect. Thank you. We will do it.
Cool.
All right. Now let's go to the fourth.
Yeah, and that brings it to the Kaizen bit. So this is, if people have read the Lean Startup, a lot of that comes from the Toyota way, but it's this idea. There's a bunch of different ideas that are kind of conflated in one. This kind of Kanban motion of left to right, single piece of work in progress is a big component of it. There's some things kind of unique to the physical world, like keeping inventory down, but that doesn't really matter in software. But one of the really, interesting things is constantly be improving. Small improvements add up, right? And one way I look at achieving product market fit and then zoning it in over time is, imagine you're a rocket ship in space, and you're trying to get to the planet of success, but you don't know where it is, right? All you can do is occasionally course correct, which direction you're pointed in, which you're going to just keep flying in that direction for however long it takes you to course correct again. So, lightning bolt first version just means get your rocket in space right away. Like, you can't get to success if you're not in a spaceship. So put a spaceship out there. And then Kaizen is essentially, how often are you course correcting, right? If you wait weeks and most startups work on that like 2-week sprint cadence, and that's like considered best of breed. Like, if you wait 2 weeks, you're only correcting that rocket ship every 2 weeks. It may take you a while. And if you're kind of like going around success because you can't make kind of finer motions to get there, you're going to be in trouble. So how do you decrease that cycle time? You make smaller changes faster, right? So customer says something to you about this, we'll hear it on a phone and we might have a fix out like an hour later. There might not even have been a story that hit our issue tracking system, but the code is suddenly in production, right? And then we can show it to them. And number one, we just, instead of waiting 2 weeks to see if it worked, we're going to find out right then and there. Usually it's something helpful. And when you deliver that fast for your customers, again, the floodgates open. They love giving feedback. Teams that listen to customers, especially early on, that you just develop such a deep relationship to them, they will keep the feedback flowing, right? Because they know you're responsive to it. And so making a bunch of small changes really rapidly matters. And there's a ton of techniques for this. Carving up stories so that they're as small as possible to deliver some new unit of value. Continuous deployment, which is something we practice. The moment we merge a PR to our main branch, it's live, 5 to 15 minutes later, right? We try to really remove the delay from, conceptualization about the delta to delivering something physically to customers. And so you constantly want to be kind of Kaizening. And that's great because it's also kind of helps mitigate that anxiety of, we put an ugly baby out. Well, don't worry. We're going to just be tweaking until we get to success. And it's not evolutionary. It can be guided by your strategy. It can be guided by, putting first things first in terms of the bugs that are coming in and the opportunities to improve the UX. Like, it's not blind evolution, but the goal is to decrease that cycle time. So you really want to look at like, how long does it take from something being reported to it being out, and finding all the slow parts in there and removing it and creating this culture of sort of rapid iteration.
So, Aaron, taken to its logical extreme, if you're doing constant tiny iterations, you wouldn't have a product roadmap. You would constantly take feedback, say, which of this how can I deliver 80% of what's being described here in 20% of the time? Let's do 20%, that 20%.
That's a wonderful approach.
It's almost like inbox zero. And whereas your product roadmap is the inbox, you've cleared that out. You're just waiting for responses from real users. Is that what you're actually advocating?
I wish I were. It's not
Okay.
quite, not quite.
Okay.
And let me give you a little bit of the above and below on that. Like, I think you do need a product roadmap because some things, but it should be focused on high level buckets. What are we hoping to achieve this quarter, the next 6 months out, a year out, et cetera? Because it's part of your strategic navigation between all the planets of success. But in a given team, one development team working on one area of the product, sometimes it's really helpful to give them some long range view. Oftentimes in sort of normal industry, they may have several sprints worth of work planned. But a lot of times if you're doing it right, it's sort of burningly obvious what the next thing you should be working on is. And if you've got a team that's really effective at, putting that first version out and then iterating, all the hand wringing over issues and stories and the write-ups and requirements, cast that aside, because that is not going to make a good team. It's not going to make a great team, right? Great team is going to just take this approach, and because they understand the customer better than others, will tend to attack the highest priority items first, do it rapidly, they'll get more shots on goal. So even if there's some suboptimal choices in there, they're course correcting so fast. That's how great products build. The process is usually introduced because the rest of the org is going to need some visibility into what's happening and some like rough expectations. And that'll change at the macro level as well. So I think the best teams don't need those short-term roadmaps, but it is helpful to have roadmaps to coordinate longer-term efforts or to engage with the broader organization. It may depend on a scale thing. And if we're talking like a 10-person startup, I don't think a roadmap matters nearly as much as listening to your customers. You
Right.
know, once you start getting larger, of course, that'll start shifting.
But those short-term roadmaps are usually intended to take someone who is talking to the customer, hearing what the problem is, and translate that conversation to someone who isn't talking to the customer.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is have the person who's building talk right to the customer
Yes.
so that this translation layer, i.e. product person, isn't required.
And I think I'll serve both sides here, right? Because
Okay.
I've got probably product people in the org that are going to listen along with engineers. That's exactly right. You don't want to play a game of telephone because you're just adding needless steps. So what do we do to avoid that? Two things. One, we hire product-minded engineers. My favorite engineers to hire are the ones that have made and independently shipped product on their own because they inherently get what matters and what doesn't and have a bias to action and often a bias to speed. And those folks, those are your 10x folks. They're like night and day. They just get it. You don't have to, hey, our workflow engine needs to kind of do X. Like, oh, got it. And they've got it in production before someone's even written a one-pager about what success would look like. It's remarkable. Hire those people like your life depends on it, because I honestly think it does. Product folks are, like, do a lot of the like, well, where are we navigating to? Like, which part of the star system is Planet Success actually in? They can get ahead of that a little bit to start giving guide rails, start lining up customers, to have these conversations. They should be pulling in engineers sidecar with them, not playing a game of translate, right? So good product folks are acting as these like space navigators, and pulling in the engineers in the starship so they can course correct immediately with them. That's your best use of folks like that.
Fantastic.
Along the same lines, actually, one thing that I personally hate, this is a long battle I have yet to win, is the term requirements. Like, a lot of organizations will have product people talk to customers, generate requirements, and then hand it off to engineering. That is the death of good product, because two reasons. One, once you start playing with the clay, those requirements might go out the window. But when they're phrased as we must do these things, and you don't have product-minded engineers, you end up devolving into this ticket taker culture where people don't feel empowered to push back on it because they don't feel like they've got the customer context because they were kept away from the customer. The wording requirement makes it sound like your job is at stake if you don't deliver this thing specifically. So even if the tech is hard, even if that one requirement amongst 10, which maybe doesn't really matter, might add 3 weeks to the project, but you don't feel empowered to speak up about it because the word requirement means required, you start getting into this dysfunction. But if you express, here's what success looks like for the customer, and it's not phrased in requirements, but a story around success, it's much easier to get people to collaborate. And if you've been bringing your engineers into those conversations with customers, you have a shared understanding of what that success looks like, and people don't need those requirements in the same way, and that lets you navigate much more smartly.
Fantastic. I love it. Is there more in the steps? That sounds like all the steps. And if there isn't more, I'd like to share with you our experiences with adopting the techniques that you mentioned in the first interview that we had.
I would love to hear. I think we covered a ton there, so I would love to hear how it's going on your end.
Okay, sounds great. So the primary thing, again, that we thought of was this bias towards shortening the time from thought to action, everything. And you mentioned rubber duck channels are in Slack are an excellent way to shorten the time from people encountering a problem to either themselves solving it by writing to their rubber ducky in Slack, or other people seeing the problem they encounter and then being able to jump in and help them. So what we did was in interviewing developers, we had them write in the rubber duck channel. We gave them the homework assignment and have them write their challenges, not to complete the assignment, but show that they're willing to share their frustrations, concerns, I don't know, in writing publicly. And it was fantastic. So that by the time we chose the developers who would come on, they were already used to using the Rubber Duck channel, and they just continued on. It was like a continuous process from interview into starting of work. The next thing that ended up happening also was this probably isn't how you intended Rubber Duck channel, but we then started to use it as an update. Here's what I did. Here's a demo. Here's what I'm planning on doing. So now instantly we all knew exactly what everybody was working on and what they had done. It was so effective that we then had non-developer team members start to mimic it. So I even now have a Rubber Duck channel where I'm posting my updates on what I'm doing, the blockers I'm running into, what my next actions are. So everybody knows what my priorities are. So that was just a huge win. And so we have now, I don't know if you can do hundreds and hundreds of Rubber Duck channels. We're only a team of 15, so it's easy to do, but it's been incredibly effective. The next thing is again, this bias towards to get things into prototype, and that has been phenomenal. But now, of course, we've prototyped internally incredibly quickly. Now we're just going to take it one step further, and we're going to push it into customers' hands tomorrow.
That's awesome. That's great. That's exciting.
Right
it's a really cool field report to hear. And you know what? I don't see why it wouldn't scale to some degree. You would have to fight the urge to like one individual be in hundreds of channels. Like you'd have to be superhuman to pull that off. But that said, local teams, local areas of the product or the company experience absolutely do that.
Yes.
I think it's really cool.
Yes.
And we're several multiples bigger than that. It's still working out quite well. So I hope to keep the party going.
Fantastic. I love it. Aaron, this is so educational. Thank you so much for sharing these methods. One thing about building the fastest team in the world is if you make other teams faster, then it's all that much harder for you to be the fastest team in the world. So it takes a lot of true bravery, clearly generosity, but also bravery to share the methods that are working for you with the rest of the world. So thank you for doing it.
Thank you for having me. This is just a lot of fun.
Awesome.